Have you ever wondered if anyone would love you if you had nothing? Today's story will show you what one man discovered when he gave up everything to find out. Montana Territory, 1887. The late September wind carried the scent of wheat harvest across 5,000 acres of rolling land that stretched from the timberline to the wide horizon, where sky met earth in a blaze of amber light. Christopher Hayes stood at the window of the master bedroom in the main house, watching dust rise from the northern fields where men he'd never met worked ground he owned by inheritance and accident of birth. 33 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from good breeding rather than labor, he pressed one palm against the glass and felt the coolness seep through. His reflection stared back blue eyes shadowed beneath brown hair that fell across his forehead in the careless way of men who'd never worried about appearances because appearance had always worked in their favor. The hands that rested on the windowsill were smooth, unmarked by calluses or scars. The hands of someone who'd spent 8 years in Boston, reading law books and arguing cases in courtrooms that smelled of mahogany and old money. 6 months. That's how long he'd been master of Whispering Pines Ranch, a title that sat on his shoulders with the awkward weight of a coat tailored for someone else. His uncle John had died suddenly last spring, leaving the entire operation to a nephew who'd fled Montana at 25 to make something of himself in the East, who'd planned never to return to this wide, empty country where a man could ride for an hour and see nothing but grass and distance. But blood called to blood, and lawyers had ways of making inheritance feel like duty. And so Christopher had closed his practice, packed his books, and traveled back to a place that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The main house sat 3 miles from the cluster of buildings where the ranch hands lived and worked, hidden behind a stand of towering pines that gave the property its name. It was a deliberate distance chosen by men who believed separation maintained authority, that a master should be a figure glimpsed rather than known. Christopher had kept that distance without thinking about it, signing papers that Kenneth brought up from the business office approving expenditures he didn't fully understand, trusting systems his uncle had built over decades. He told himself he was learning that a man couldn't master a ranch of this size in mere months. That patience would bring understanding. He was beginning to suspect patience had made him blind. The door opened without a knock. Kenneth Hayes, 5 years older and 20 pounds heavier, walked in with the confident stride of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. He carried a folder stuffed with documents, his face set in the expression Christopher had learned to recognize as determination, masquerading as reason. "We need to talk about the flowers proposal." Christopher didn't turn from the window. "I've already given you my answer 3 times." Kenneth set the folder on the desk with enough force to make his point. "You're being stubborn, Christopher. Foolish. Ronald Flowers owns 10,000 acres directly adjacent to ours. His daughter Nicole is educated, refined, everything a man in your position should want. This marriage would create the largest agricultural operation in the territory. We'd control the entire valley from here to the mining towns. The profit potential alone. I'm not marrying for profit." The words came out harder than intended, sharpened by arguments they'd had too many times already. Kenneth's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. Then what are you marrying for love romance? Christopher, you're 33 years old. You've spent the last 2 years hiding from the world because one woman don't. The single word carried enough warning to stop Kenneth mid-sentence. They stood in silence, broken only by the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, a sound that seemed to measure not just time, but the growing chasm between what Kenneth wanted and what Christopher could give. Finally, Kenneth spoke again, his voice lower but no less insistent. You can't run this ranch alone. You need alliances, connections, family. The Flowers Union makes sense from every angle. Ronald has political influence that extends to the territorial capital. Nicole would be an asset in every social situation. And if you'd just meet her, actually talk to her instead of rejecting the idea out of hand, I said no. Kenneth picked up the folder, but his eyes stayed on Christopher with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might have been concern. You're going to die alone, Christopher. A bitter old man in this big house, surrounded by nothing but cattle and dirt, with no one to carry on the family name. Is that really what you want? He left before Christopher could answer, pulling the door closed with careful control that felt more damning than a slam. The silence that followed pressed against Christopher's ears like water, and he found himself thinking about the question, turning it over the way a man examines a stone pulled from a river looking for flaws in the smooth surface. What did he want? The memory rose unbidden, unwelcome, sharp as broken glass. Boston 2 years ago, late autumn, the kind of evening when the city smelled of coal smoke and wet leaves, when gas lamps painted golden circles on wet cobblestones. Christopher had been engaged to Stephanie Ashford for 6 months, had sent out invitations for a wedding that was supposed to be the social event of the season. She was beautiful in the way that made men turn their heads on the street, educated at the finest schools, fluent in French, and passably accomplished at the piano. Her father owned a shipping company that moved goods from Boston to New York and back again, accumulating wealth with the steady reliability of the tides. Christopher had loved her, or thought he had, or at least convinced himself that what he felt was love, rather than the intoxicating combination of beauty and status and the way she looked at him in crowded ballrooms. He'd arrived early that evening at her father's townhouse on Beacon Hill, let himself in through the servant's entrance with the familiarity of a man already considered family. He'd planned to surprise her, had brought flowers from the shop on Charles Street, had been thinking about their wedding night with the kind of anticipation that made young men foolish. Instead, he'd heard her voice drifting from the parlor where she stood with her older sister, unaware of his presence in the hallway beyond. 2 years. Mother says I can endure anything for 2 years. Her sister's response was muffled, but Stephanie's laugh carried clear and cold. Of course I don't love him. He's earnest and dull, and spends his evenings reading legal briefs like they're poetry. But he has the Hayes name, the Hayes fortune, and once the properties are transferred into joint ownership, well, divorce laws are surprisingly accommodating if one knows the right judges. Father's already consulted with the firm. The flowers had fallen from Christopher's hand petals, scattering across the expensive carpet in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. He'd stood frozen, each word landing like a physical blow, painting a picture of himself as a mark, a fool, a means to an end for a woman who saw him not as a person, but as a collection of assets to be acquired and eventually discarded. He'd left without confronting her, rode through the night until exhaustion dragged him from the saddle. The next day he'd broken the engagement with a single terse letter that explained nothing. Stephanie and her family had responded with a campaign of rumors that painted Christopher as unstable, paranoid, possibly dangerous. They'd whispered about his sudden departure from Boston, suggested mental weakness, hinted at violent tendencies that had no basis in truth, but spread through society with the infectious efficiency of scandal. Christopher had let them talk? The truth would have required explaining what he'd overheard, admitting he'd been stupid enough to believe a beautiful woman might love him for himself rather than his bank account, and his pride couldn't bear that exposure. Better to be thought mad than pitiable. But the wound had festered. Trust once shattered proved harder to rebuild than a man might hope. Every woman who smiled at him became suspect. Every friendly word weighted with potential calculation. The world divided into those who wanted something from him and those who didn't know what he had to take. Montana had seemed like escape, a place where he could start fresh, where his name and fortune were distant abstractions rather than defining characteristics. Except his name and fortune had followed him here, wrapped around him like chains disguised as silk. Christopher turned from the window and made his way downstairs, following the back hallway that led to the kitchen, where Kathleen Green ruled with the absolute authority of a woman who'd been part of the household longer than anyone could remember. She was 65 years old, white-haired and broad-shouldered, with hands weathered from decades of work and eyes that saw more than people intended to reveal. She'd been the ranch cook since before Christopher was born, had helped raise him and Kenneth after their mother died of fever when Christopher was 7. If there was anyone on this property whose opinion he trusted without reservation, it was the woman who stood at the massive iron stove stirring something that filled the kitchen with the scent of beef and herbs. She looked up as he entered, and her expression softened in the way it did when she forgot to maintain the proper distance between employer and servant. "You look troubled." He pulled out a chair at the rough wooden table where the kitchen staff took their meals. "Kenneth thinks I should marry Nicole Flowers." Kathleen snorted a sound that conveyed volumes of opinion in a single breath. "Kenneth thinks with ledgers instead of his heart, always has. He says I'm being stubborn, that the ranch needs alliances." She turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, and fixed him with a look that took him back to childhood, to scraped knees and broken toys, and the small cruelties children inflict on each other. "What do you need, Christopher?" The question hung between them, weighted with more than casual curiosity. Christopher found himself unable to answer, the words tangling in his throat. Kathleen sat down across from him, her movements careful in the way of people whose joints had started to protest daily labor. "Something's been weighing on you these past weeks. I've seen it in your face, the way you stare out at those fields like you're looking for something you can't name." The accounts don't make sense. The admission came out before he'd consciously decided to voice it. Kathleen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a confirmation of suspicions she'd already harbored. "How so?" "The expenditures are higher than they should be. Food costs, equipment, wages, everything runs above what comparable operations spend. But when I ride past the worker quarters, I see buildings that need repair equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The numbers don't match what I observe." Kathleen's silence spoke louder than agreement. "You know something." It wasn't a question. She nodded slowly, her face settling into lines of resignation and anger held too long. "I know the workers are suffering. I know the food I send down to their kitchen is half what your uncle used to provide, even though the budget shows I'm ordering the same amounts. I know men are leaving in the night because the wages aren't enough to feed their families, and the ones who stay look thinner every week." Christopher felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Gary Webb has run this ranch for 15 years. My uncle trusted him completely. Your uncle was too ill those last years to see what was happening. And Gary's clever, I'll give him that. He knows how to keep the right people happy, how to make sure the complaints never reach the main house." "Why didn't you tell me?" Kathleen's expression turned sad. "I tried, Christopher. 3 times I've mentioned concerns, and each time you told me Gary knew best, that your uncle had faith in him, that I should trust the system. You weren't ready to hear what I was saying." The truth of it stung. He'd been so focused on learning the business, on proving himself capable, that he'd dismissed warning signs as the natural friction of old ways meeting new management. He'd wanted to believe the system worked because questioning it meant admitting he didn't understand what his uncle had built, that inheriting property didn't automatically convey the wisdom to run it. "Tell me everything." She did. For the next hour, Kathleen laid out a catalog of suffering that had been happening 3 miles from where Christopher slept in comfort. Workers paid wages far below what the ledgers showed, with the difference vanishing into Gary's pockets. Food shipments diverted and sold elsewhere, replaced with cheap substitutes that left men hungry and weak. Equipment budgets approved and then ignored, leaving laborers to work with tools so worn they posed active danger. And beneath it all, a culture of fear maintained through casual cruelty, public humiliation, and the constant threat of dismissal that kept everyone silent. When she finished, Christopher sat in silence, shame and anger warring in his chest. This was his land, his responsibility, and while he'd been playing at being a rancher from the safe distance of the main house, people had been suffering under his name, under his authority. "I need to see it myself." Kathleen shook her head. "Gary will hide everything if you go down there as the owner. He's had years to perfect his deceptions." Christopher stood pacing the length of the kitchen, his mind working through possibilities and discarding them one after another. Truth needed to see with his own eyes what was happening in the quarters, needed evidence that couldn't be explained away or hidden behind careful accounting. But Kathleen was right. If he went as Christopher Hayes, master of Whispering Pines, Gary would stage manage everything present, a careful facade that revealed nothing. The idea came to him fully formed, so audacious, it seemed to arrive from outside his own thoughts. "What if I didn't go as the owner?" Kathleen's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting? I go as a worker, disguise myself, use a false name, live among them for a few weeks, long enough to see the truth, gather evidence, understand what's really happening." "That's madness." "Is it? I've been in Boston for 8 years. I came back 6 months ago, and I've barely left this house. Most of the workers have never seen my face. With the right preparation, Gary would recognize you." "Would he? I was 25 when I left clean-shaven, soft from city living. I'm 33 now. If I grow a beard, cut my hair short, rough up my hands, dress in work clothes, affect an accent. He was thinking out loud now, the plan taking shape as he spoke. Gary looks at workers as interchangeable labor. He doesn't see people, he sees tools. And I've learned enough Irish from the dock workers in Boston to fake a convincing accent. Kathleen stood, her face a mixture of fear and something that might have been admiration. This is dangerous, Christopher. If Gary discovers who you are, then I'll deal with it. But I can't let innocent people suffer on my land while I sit up here in ignorance. My uncle would be ashamed of what I've allowed to happen. The mention of his uncle seemed to decide something for Kathleen. She crossed to a cabinet and pulled out paper and pen. If you're going to do this foolishness, we'll do it properly. You'll need a background story, work history references, and you'll need to look the part. They spent the next 2 hours crafting the identity of Michael O'Connor, an Irish immigrant who'd worked the Boston docks before heading west, looking for farm work. Kathleen wrote a letter of reference in disguised handwriting, claiming Michael had been employed at a shipping warehouse that had recently closed. Christopher practiced the accent until Kathleen grudgingly admitted it sounded authentic, at least to ears that had never been to Ireland. Kenneth, when informed of the plan that evening, reacted exactly as Christopher expected. "This is insanity. You're the owner of Whispering Pines. You have responsibilities, legal obligations, a position in society. You can't just pretend to be some common laborer." "I can, and I will." "What if someone recognizes you, who I've met perhaps a dozen people since returning to Montana, all of them society figures who would never lower themselves to visit the worker quarters. The laborers themselves have no idea what I look like. You're the one who's always complaining I don't engage with the community." Kenneth's face flushed. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. What am I supposed to tell people when they ask where you are?" "Tell them I went to Boston to handle some legal matters related to the estate. It's plausible enough that no one will question it." "How long do you plan to maintain this charade?" "As long as it takes to understand what's happening and gather the evidence I need to make changes." Kenneth paced the length of the study, his agitation clear in every movement. "You're doing this because of her, aren't you? Because Stephanie hurt you, and now you don't trust anyone. You think by putting on rags and playing pretend you'll somehow find people who see past your money to your precious, authentic self." The accuracy of the observation stung, but Christopher kept his expression neutral. "I'm doing this because my workers are suffering, and I need to know why. If you won't support the decision, at least agree to keep the secret." Kenneth stopped pacing, his shoulders dropping in defeat. "Fine, I'll maintain your fiction, but when this blows up in your face, don't expect me to clean up the mess." Over the next 3 weeks, Christopher transformed himself. He stopped shaving, letting a beard grow thick and rough. He cut his hair short and uneven, mimicking the work of someone who couldn't afford a proper barber. He spent hours each day working in the vegetable garden behind the main house, letting the sun darken his skin and roughening his hands with calluses earned through blisters. He practiced walking with the slight slouch of someone accustomed to physical labor, practiced keeping his eyes down in the presence of authority, practiced every small detail that separated a man of property from a man of poverty. Kathleen helped bringing him old clothes from storage, worn work shirts, and patched trousers that had belonged to laborers long since departed. She showed him how to tie his boots in the hasty way of men rushing to work before dawn, how to roll his sleeves to the elbow, how to tuck in his shirt with the carelessness of someone who'd never thought about appearance. On the last day before his descent to the worker quarters, she stood in the kitchen and studied him with critical eyes. "You look the part, but looking and being are different things, Christopher. Those men down there live hard lives. They'll spot a fraud faster than you might think." "I know. And if Gary finds out who you are—" "He won't. I'll be careful." She pulled him into an embrace that reminded him of childhood, of scraped knees and hurt feelings, and the comfort of being held by someone who loved you without calculation. "You're a stubborn fool, just like your uncle." "I'll take that as a compliment." She pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "Come back safe, and come back soon." Late on a Friday afternoon, when the sun hung low and painted the Montana sky in shades of fire, Christopher Hayes walked down the winding trail that connected the main house to the worker quarters. He carried nothing but a canvas satchel holding a change of clothes and the forged letter of reference. With each step the weight of his name and fortune fell away, replaced by the careful construction of Michael O'Connor, an Irishman, with nothing to offer but strong hands and a willingness to work. The worker quarters materialized from the dusty haze like something conjured from a darker version of the ranch Christopher thought he knew. 12 long barracks built from rough timber, their roofs patched with tar paper that gleamed dully in the failing light. A communal kitchen that leaned slightly to one side, smoke drifting from a chimney that needed repair. Tool sheds with doors that hung askew on rusted hinges. Everywhere he looked, Christopher saw evidence of neglect of money allocated but never spent, of the gap between what he'd approved and what had actually arrived. Men moved between the buildings with the tired shuffle of those who'd spent the day in hard labor. Their clothes stained with dirt and sweat, their faces marked with exhaustion that went deeper than muscle fatigue. Some glanced at him with the wary curiosity reserved for newcomers, but most didn't bother looking up. In a place where people came and went with the regularity of seasons, a new face wasn't worth the energy of interest. Gary Webb sat on a heavy wooden bench near the largest tool shed, a ledger open on his lap and a cash box at his feet. 50 years old, with the kind of thick build that came from good eating rather than hard work. He had small eyes set deep in a face mapped with broken capillaries, and the ruddy complexion of a man who drank more than was wise. He looked up as Christopher approached, his gaze moving over the newcomer with the assessing coldness of someone evaluating livestock. Christopher kept his eyes lowered, his posture respectful, his accent firmly in place. "Beggin' your pardon, sir, I'm lookin' for work. Was told Whispering Pines might be hirin'." Gary held out his hand without speaking. Christopher passed over the letter of reference. The foreman read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the words, and Christopher fought the urge to stand straighter to meet the man's eyes with the directness of equals. Michael O'Connor wouldn't do that. Michael O'Connor was desperate, grateful for any opportunity, willing to accept whatever terms were offered. Irish. It wasn't a question, but Christopher nodded anyway. "Aye, sir. From County Cork originally. Been workin' the Boston docks these past years, but the warehouse closed, and I thought I'd try my luck out west." Gary spat into the dirt, the gesture carrying more contempt than any words. "You people are all the same. Lazy drunks who'd rather beg than earn an honest wage. But I'm short-handed, and I need bodies for the wheat harvest." He stood tucking the letter into his ledger, and Christopher noticed how the man's belt cut into his belly, how his boots were finer than anything the workers wore, how everything about him spoke of comfort, extracted from other people's suffering. "Work starts at 4 in the morning. Wheat fields northern section. You'll make $8 a month, food included. Sleep in bunkhouse 7, that one over there." He pointed to a structure that looked no different from the others. "Don't cause trouble. Don't steal. Don't backtalk. And you might last longer than most of your kind. Understood? $8. Christopher knew from the ledgers that he'd approved $15 a month for laborers. The difference wasn't accidental error. It was theft, systematic and ongoing, happening under his signature and his authority. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Gary turned away, dismissing him with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never considered workers as fully human. Christopher picked up his satchel and walked toward bunkhouse 7, conscious of eyes watching from doorways and windows, conscious of stepping into a world that existed parallel to his own, but operated under completely different rules. The bunkhouse interior smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the kind of accumulated despair that seeped into wood and never quite left. 20 canvas cots lined the walls, most already claimed by bags or rolled blankets. A few men sat on their beds, mending clothes, or just staring at nothing in particular. No one spoke to Christopher as he claimed an empty cot near the back, as he set down his satchel and tested the canvas that would be his bed for however long this masquerade lasted. Dinner was served in the communal kitchen an hour after sunset. Thin bean soup with meat so scarce it might have been imaginary, accompanied by hard bread that tasted of nothing but flour and disappointment. The men ate in silence, hunched over their bowls, like they were protecting something precious, and Christopher forced himself to finish every drop, even though his stomach rebelled against food that bore no resemblance to what Kathleen served at the main house. Afterward, sitting outside the bunkhouse, as stars began to emerge from the darkening sky, Christopher listened to the low conversations that developed as men too tired to sleep found comfort in words. "Did you see Gary yelling at that Morgan girl again?" The voice came from his left, belonging to a man Christopher hadn't yet met. Someone else responded from the darkness. "Sarah. Course I did. He torments her every day." Another voice, this one tinged with disgust. "She's the thief's daughter. Bad blood runs true. Her father stole 50 head of cattle from Ronald Flowers. Whole valley knows it. Man's rotting in prison where he belongs." Christopher kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, just another new worker trying to understand the social landscape. The name Rebecca. He filed it away, along with the tone of contempt that accompanied it, the casual certainty that guilt passed from parent to child like an inherited trait. A different voice, older and rougher, cut through the gossip. "Daniel Morgan never stole anything. That trial was a sham, and everyone with eyes could see it." "Shut it, old man Edward. You'll get yourself fired talking like that. I'm 72 years old, and I've worked this land since before most of you were born. Gary can fire me if he wants, but that won't make what I said any less true." The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, complaints about the food and the equipment, and the aches that came with age and hard labor. Christopher let the words wash over him, building a picture of this place, from the fragments people revealed when they thought no one important was listening. A girl named Rebecca, daughter of a convicted thief targeted by Gary for reasons that seemed to go beyond her father's alleged crimes. An old man named Edward who still believed in innocence when everyone else had accepted guilt as fact. And beneath it all, the constant undercurrent of fear, the knowledge that speaking too loudly or questioning too openly could cost a man the only thing standing between him and starvation. Christopher lay on his cot that night, listening to the symphony of snores and coughs and restless movements of men who worked too hard for too little and wondered how he'd been so blind for so long. This suffering happened under his name, funded by his inheritance, protected by his ignorance. Whatever Stephanie had taken from him in Boston, whatever wounds she'd inflicted on his ability to trust, none of it compared to the damage his absence had caused here. He would make it right, but first he had to understand the full scope of what had gone wrong, had to see with his own eyes, and gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And that meant becoming, for these few weeks or months, not Christopher Hayes, but Michael O'Connor, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The metal bar clanging against the wooden post pulled him from shallow sleep into darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hands. Around him, men groaned and cursed as they dragged themselves from thin mattresses, moving with the automatic motions of people who'd performed this ritual so many times it required no thought. Christopher followed their example, pulling on his boots in the dark, stumbling out into air so cold it burned his lungs. For in the morning, the stars still blazed overhead, indifferent to human suffering, while somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed its futile challenge to the night. The men filed toward the fields, carrying tools retrieved from the shed, and Christopher grabbed a scythe, its wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands before his. The weight felt foreign, the balance all wrong, and he had to consciously adjust his grip to keep it from slipping. The wheat fields stretched into darkness, row after endless row of grain ready for harvest. Gary appeared on horseback, a shadow against the slightly less dark sky, and barked orders that sent men scattering to their assigned sections. Christopher found himself next to a worker who introduced himself as James, a thin man of perhaps 40, who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to conserve every ounce of energy. "First time," Christopher nodded, hoping the darkness hid his inexperience. "Keep your swing steady, not too hard. You trying to cut the wheat, not kill it. Pace yourself, or you'll be useless by noon." The advice proved invaluable. Within 30 minutes, Christopher's hands burned where blisters were forming. Within an hour, his back screamed protests that made him want to stop, to straighten to rest. But around him, men twice his age kept working, kept the steady rhythm of swing and gather, and he forced himself to match their pace, even as every muscle in his body rebelled against the unfamiliar motion. The sun rose slowly, painting the wheat gold, and then yellow, and finally the pale color of straw ready to harvest. With the light came heat that built with each passing hour, turning the field into something close to an oven. Sweat soaked through Christopher's shirt, dripped into his eyes, made the scythe handle slippery in his grip. His vision started to blur at the edges, and he realized with dim alarm that he'd forgotten to bring water, hadn't understood that men working this hard needed constant hydration just to survive. He looked around, hoping to see someone with a canteen he might beg from, but the workers nearby were focused on their own sections, their own survival. Christopher's mouth felt like it was full of cotton, his head beginning to pound in time with his heartbeat. He should stop, should ask for help, should do something other than keep swinging the scythe with movements that were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. The ground tilted beneath his feet. He caught himself on the scythe handle, leaned heavily on it, trying to will strength back into legs that had turned to water. His vision darkened further, tunneling down to a small circle of light that was rapidly shrinking. Then a hand touched his arm, gentle but insistent, and a tin cup appeared in his line of sight, filled with water that gleamed like liquid salvation. Christopher looked up into the face of the woman holding the cup, and for a moment, the simple act of seeing her drove every other thought from his mind. She was perhaps 25, with brown hair pulled back beneath a faded scarf and eyes the color of rich earth, deep brown, flecked with gold that caught the sunlight. Her skin had been darkened by long hours outdoors, and her arms bare below the elbow, where she'd rolled up her sleeves, showed the lean muscle of someone accustomed to physical labor. But it was her expression that stopped him, the way she looked at him, not with pity or contempt or calculation, but with a simple recognition of another person's need. He took the cup with shaking hands, drank deeply, felt the water cut through the cotton in his mouth and throat. When he finished, she stood waiting patient and unhurried while he caught his breath, and the world slowly stopped spinning. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, some wordless communication that felt more profound than the simple exchange of water between strangers. She took the cup back, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, gave a small nod that might have been acknowledgment or encouragement, or just polite dismissal, and walked away back to her section of the field where she knelt between rows of plants Christopher couldn't identify from this distance. He watched her go, this woman who'd shown him kindness when no one else had bothered to look in his direction, and felt something shift in his chest, some dormant part of himself that had been sleeping since Boston, suddenly stirring to life. Around him, men continued working their scythes, rising and falling with mechanical regularity. James glanced over his expression, unreadable. That was Rebecca Morgan, the one they were talking about last night, daughter of the thief. Christopher looked across the field to where Rebecca worked her movements quick and precise, and understood that he was looking at the girl Gary tormented, the one everyone believed carried her father's guilt in her blood. He understood something else, too. Whatever he'd come here to discover about Gary's corruption, whatever evidence he needed to gather about theft and suffering, his mission had just become far more complicated. Because in that moment, when her eyes met his, when she'd offered water without expectation or judgment, Christopher Hayes had felt something he'd convinced himself was impossible. The afternoon sun reached its peak, turning the fields into a furnace that baked away thought and reduced existence to the simple rhythm of survival. Christopher worked in a haze of heat and pain, his hands bleeding now where blisters had burst, and reformed his back, a solid mass of agony that made each movement a conscious act of will. Around him, men collapsed into brief rest. During the few minutes, Gary allowed gulping water and wiping sweat from faces that had gone from red to dangerously pale. Gary rode through the rows on his horse, observing the work with the critical eye of a man looking for any excuse to find fault. When he reached the section where Rebecca worked sorting potatoes at the edge of the field, he reined in his mount and stared down at her with an expression that made Christopher's hands tighten on the scythe handle. The foreman's voice carried across the field, pitched loud enough that everyone could hear. "Rebecca Morgan, your sorting is sloppy. You're mixing spoiled potatoes with the good harvest." Christopher was close enough to see Rebecca's baskets, close enough to observe that her work was flawless, each potato examined and placed with a care that put other workers to shame. There was nothing spoiled in her collection, nothing that justified Gary's accusation. It was a lie spoken publicly and deliberately, designed not to correct work, but to humiliate. "I'll dock your rations for the week. Maybe hunger will teach you quality control." Rebecca didn't lift her head, didn't speak in her own defense. She simply continued working with the same precise movements, as if Gary hadn't spoken, as if public shame was so common it no longer warranted response. Around her, other workers looked away, found sudden interest in their own tasks, participated through silence in the injustice unfolding before them. Christopher felt rage build in his chest, hot and urgent, demanding action. Every instinct screamed to drop the scythe, to stride across the field, to call out Gary's lie in front of everyone. His muscles tensed, ready to move his mouth, opening to form words that would shatter his disguise and reveal exactly who Michael O'Connor really was. But James's hand clamped down on his shoulder, a warning pressure that held him in place. "Don't. He'll destroy you if you interfere. Just keep working." The moment passed. Gary rode away, leaving Rebecca to her labor and her humiliation. Christopher returned to his scythe, but his movements had lost their rhythm, his hands shaking with suppressed fury that had nowhere to go. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, and Christopher had never been more grateful for the approach of darkness. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, every part of it, screaming for rest, for food, for the blessed relief of stillness. The walk back to the quarters seemed to take hours, each step a separate negotiation between will and flesh. Dinner was the same thin soup, the same hard bread consumed in the same oppressive silence. Christopher forced it down, knowing he needed fuel, even if his stomach rebelled against the quality. Around him, men ate with the mechanical efficiency of those who'd long since stopped expecting meals to provide pleasure, who viewed food simply as necessary fuel for another day of labor. Outside the bunkhouse, as twilight deepened into night, and the first stars emerged, the conversations resumed. But Christopher barely heard them. His eyes kept drifting to where Rebecca sat alone near the women's quarters, a small figure in the gathering darkness, isolated by reputation and Gary's deliberate cruelty. Edward, the old man who'd spoken the night before, lowered himself onto the bench beside Christopher with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun to fail. "You're the Irish boy." "Michael. Edward Carter. Been on this ranch 30 years, worked for Christopher Hayes' uncle when the boy was still running around in short pants." Christopher kept his expression neutral, his accent in place. "Seems like hard work." Edward's laugh was bitter. "Used to be fair work for fair pay. Old John Hayes, he believed a man deserved to eat well and sleep warm if he put in honest labor. Things changed when Gary took over the running of things. Got worse after John died and the nephew inherited. Word is, the new owner never even comes down from the big house, just signs whatever Gary puts in front of him." The assessment stung, accurate as it was. Christopher had been exactly that kind of owner, distant and negligent, and willing to trust systems he didn't understand. What about the girl Rebecca? Edward's face softened into something like protective fondness. Jonathan Morgan's daughter. Her father was the best wagon driver in Montana Territory, honest as the day is long. Loved those horses better than most men love their own children. 3 years ago, he was accused of stealing 50 head of cattle from Ronald Flowers. Trial lasted 2 days. Jury convicted him on testimony from 3 men who all worked for Flowers. Jonathan got 10 years hard labor. And you don't think he did it? I know he didn't. I'd stake my life on it. Jonathan discovered something. Something about how Flowers was using the cattle transport routes. Started asking questions, and 2 weeks later, the accusation came. Gary used to work for Flowers before he came here. Convenient, that connection. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a pattern that connected Gary's corruption to Ronald Flowers, the same man Kenneth wanted Christopher to ally with through marriage, the same man who'd apparently framed an innocent driver to protect his own criminal operation. Christopher watched Rebecca in the distance, understanding now the weight she carried, the burden of a father's conviction and a mother's suffering and a community's contempt. And yet she'd shown him kindness that afternoon, had given him water when he needed it most, had looked at him with eyes that held no judgment, despite living in a world that judged her constantly. He thought about what Kenneth had said about hiding from the world because Stephanie had hurt him, about looking for people who could see past his money to his authentic self. The accusation had hit close to truth. He had been hiding, using wealth and distance as shields against the possibility of further betrayal. But Rebecca Morgan, daughter of a convicted thief, surviving on $3 a month, and the charity of an old man, had no shields at all. She lived exposed to cruelty and judgment, and still found the generosity to help a stranger collapsing in a wheat field. That night, lying on his cot while other men slept around him, Christopher made a silent vow. He would discover the truth about Gary's corruption. He would find evidence of the connection to Ronald Flowers. He would clear Jonathan Morgan's name and restore justice to a family that had suffered 3 years of undeserved punishment. And he would protect Rebecca from Gary's cruelty, even if it meant revealing his identity before he was ready, even if it cost him everything he'd come here to accomplish. Because in that moment by the creek, when she'd handed him water and their eyes had met, Christopher Hayes had glimpsed something he'd thought Stephanie had destroyed forever. The possibility that somewhere in this vast and complicated world there might be a person who would see him, truly see him, not as a collection of assets or a useful alliance or a means to an end, but simply as a man worthy of basic human kindness. It was a fragile hope, dangerous to hold and impossible to ignore. And as he drifted toward sleep, his body aching and his hands torn, Christopher understood that he'd already crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. 3 weeks reshaped Christopher in ways he hadn't anticipated. The blisters on his palms hardened into calluses that changed how his hands felt against everything they touched. The sun darkened his skin until the Boston pallor vanished beneath bronze that made him nearly unrecognizable even to himself when he caught his reflection in water troughs. His shoulders broadened from constant labor muscles developing in his back, and arms that came from lifting, hauling swinging tools from dawn until the light failed. The beard grew thick enough to obscure the sharp lines of his jaw, and the Irish accent became second nature, rolling off his tongue without conscious effort. He learned to move through the quarters like a ghost, observing, without seeming to observe, listening to conversations that revealed the machinery of Gary's corruption. The wheat that vanished from the storage buildings reappeared on wagons headed east, sold to merchants in towns where questions weren't asked and receipts weren't kept. The tools Christopher had authorized for purchase 3 months earlier existed only on paper. The money diverted into Gary's pockets while workers made do with equipment so worn it frequently broke mid-task, causing injuries that went unreported because injured men didn't get paid. The food budget showed generous allocations for meat and vegetables, but what actually reached the communal kitchen was grain, stretched thin with water and occasional scraps that might once have been edible. Christopher documented it all in a small notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress, writing by candlelight after the other men slept, recording names and dates and amounts in a careful hand that would have betrayed him instantly if anyone had seen it. He noted the night Gary met a wagon driver behind the north fence, watched money change hands while 20 sacks of flour disappeared into darkness. He recorded the conversation between Gary and his assistant foreman, calculating how to skim another percentage point from the wage payments without triggering mass departures. He observed the systematic cruelty directed at anyone who questioned the system, the public humiliations designed to terrify others into silence. But more than corruption, Christopher discovered the texture of suffering, the way it wore on people who had no escape and no hope of change. He saw it in the faces of men too tired to speak after dinner, in the silence that fell when Gary rode past, in the careful distance everyone maintained from Rebecca Morgan, as if her father's conviction had made her contagious. He felt it in his own body, the relentless ache that never quite faded, even after a night's rest, the constant hunger that came from portions too small to fuel the work, demanded the creeping hopelessness that settled over the quarters like fog. Sunday arrived as a gift from a merciful universe. No work, just the blessed freedom to move slowly, to wash away a week's worth of grime, to exist without Gary's voice cutting through the morning air. The creek behind the ranch property ran clear and cold, fed by mountain snowmelt that hadn't yet learned the meaning of pollution. Workers made their way there in small groups, carrying laundry and soap, claiming spots along the bank where privacy and modesty could coexist with the practical need to get clean. Christopher arrived late, hoping the crowd would have thinned. He found Rebecca kneeling beside the water, scrubbing a dress against rocks, worn smooth by years of similar use. She'd removed the scarf that usually covered her hair, and the sun caught strands of brown that held unexpected depths of amber and gold. Her hands moved with the same precision he'd observed in the fields, methodical and thorough, wasting no motion. He hesitated, uncertain whether approaching would be welcome or intrusive. 3 weeks of watching her from careful distance had taught him that Rebecca existed in isolation by design and necessity, that the other workers maintained their separation not from cruelty, but from the pragmatic understanding that association with her could redirect Gary's attention in unwelcome ways. To approach her publicly was to invite scrutiny, to mark himself as either foolishly naive or deliberately contrary. Christopher chose contrary. He moved upstream close enough that conversation wouldn't require shouting, but far enough to preserve the fiction of accidental proximity. He knelt at the water's edge, pulled a shirt from his bag, and began the awkward process of scrubbing cloth against stone. Rebecca glanced up, her eyes registering his presence without surprise or concern. For long minutes, neither spoke. The sound of water rushing over rocks, the distant voices of other workers, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. These filled the silence between them with a quality that felt companionable rather than awkward. Finally, Rebecca broke the quiet. "You're the Irish one, Michael." Her voice carried the slight roughness of someone who didn't speak often, who'd learned to conserve words the way others conserved food. "Aye, and you're Rebecca." "Everyone knows who I am." The statement held no self-pity, just acknowledgement of a fact as immutable as weather. Christopher wrestled with his shirt, trying to work soap into fabric that seemed determined to resist improvement. "You're doing it wrong." Rebecca set aside her own laundry and moved closer, taking the shirt from his hands before he could protest. She demonstrated the technique, showing him how to work the soap, where to apply pressure, how to wring out water without tearing seams. "You've never washed your own clothes before." It wasn't quite a question. Christopher felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with exertion. "Had a woman did the washing back in Boston. Lost that luxury when I came west." Rebecca handed back the shirt, and their fingers brushed in the exchange a moment of contact that shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow did. She returned to her spot, resumed her work, and Christopher thought the conversation had ended. Then she spoke again, her tone carrying genuine curiosity. "Why did you come? West Boston's got work, got opportunity. Montana's got dirt and distance." Christopher chose his words carefully, mixing truth with necessary fiction. "Had a position at a shipping warehouse. Company went under, owner disappeared with whatever money remained. Left a lot of us with nothing but experience that didn't transfer to other work. Heard there was land out here, ranches hiring, figured I'd try my luck." "And is your luck good?" He thought about the question, about the blisters and exhaustion and hunger, about Gary's cruelty and the injustice woven through every day. He thought about the woman kneeling a few feet away, washing clothes in a creek, while the world treated her like contamination. Better than it might have been. Met some decent folk. Rebecca's hands stilled in the water. She looked at him fully for the first time, and Christopher saw intelligence in her eyes that circumstances had forced to hide beneath deference and silence. She was assessing him, measuring the gap between what he said and what he meant, searching for the angle that everyone had taught her to expect. "Decent folk don't usually talk to me." "Then maybe I'm indecent." The corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to make Christopher's chest feel suddenly tight. She wrung out her dress, laid it carefully on the grass to dry, and pulled another garment from her bag. "They say my father was a thief. Stole cattle from Ronald Flowers, got caught, got convicted. 10 years hard labor up at the territorial prison." Christopher kept his hands busy with his laundry, his expression neutral. "What do you say?" "I say my father never stole anything in his life. I say the trial was a performance with the verdict decided before the first witness testified. I say Ronald Flowers wanted him silenced and found men willing to lie for the right price." The conviction in her voice cut through any possibility of doubt. This wasn't the desperate hope of a daughter clinging to innocence in the face of evidence. This was certainty earned through intimate knowledge, through years of watching a man's character reveal itself in daily actions. "You believe that strongly. I know it the way I know water's wet and fire burns. My father drove wagons for every ranch in this valley for 15 years. Never had a single complaint, never lost a head of livestock, never took a penny that wasn't his. Then he started asking questions about inconsistencies in the transport logs, about cattle that should have arrived at market but never appeared in the final counts. 2 weeks later, Gary Webb, who used to work for Ronald Flowers, showed up with witnesses claiming they saw my father loading stolen cattle onto his wagon in the middle of the night. Christopher's hands tightened on the wet fabric, his mind racing through implications that connected dots he'd already begun to suspect formed a pattern. Gary and Ronald Flowers, cattle theft, a driver who asked inconvenient questions. "Where's your mother?" The question came out before he'd fully thought it through, driven by the need to understand the full scope of Rebecca's circumstances. Her expression shifted, grief passing across her features like clouds shadowing the sun. 2 miles from here, in a shack that used to house ranch equipment before they built the new storage buildings. She's sick, has been for a year now, getting worse instead of better. Consumption, the doctor says, needs medicine that costs $20 a month, which might as well be $20,000 for all the chance I have of affording it. $20. Christopher's monthly clothing allowance at the main house exceeded that amount. The wine cellar held bottles worth more than a year of medicine for a dying woman. "How much do you make?" $3 a month. Gary pays me less than anyone else, says it's because I'm unreliable, says I should be grateful he hired me at all, given my father's reputation. $3. The injustice of it hit Christopher like a physical blow, the kind of casual cruelty that treated human suffering as nothing more than an opportunity for exploitation. He wanted to tell her everything right then, to reveal that he owned this ranch, and Gary's employment would end within the hour, that her mother would have the best medical care money could buy. That justice would finally reach the men who'd destroyed her family. But revealing himself now would raise questions he couldn't answer without admitting he'd been lying since the moment they met. And something in him, some part that Stephanie had wounded, and these 3 weeks had begun to heal, needed Rebecca to know him as Michael, first to see the man beneath the wealth and property and family name. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family, for what you're carrying." Rebecca looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Why, you didn't cause it." "Because suffering deserves acknowledgement even from strangers. Because nobody should have to carry that weight alone." The words hung between them, and Christopher saw Rebecca's defenses waver, saw her consider the possibility that kindness might exist without ulterior motive. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it, returning her attention to the laundry in her hands. They worked in silence for another hour, but it was a different silence now, comfortable and shared. When Rebecca finished and gathered her clean clothes, she paused before leaving. "Thank you, Michael, for the conversation, for not treating me like I'm contagious. Same time next Sunday." She hesitated, then nodded. "Same time." Christopher watched her walk back toward the quarters, this woman who'd been dealt such an unfair hand and still found the strength to show kindness to a collapsing stranger in a wheat field. He thought about the money sitting in the main house safe, thought about the power he could wield with a single conversation with Kenneth, thought about how easy it would be to solve Rebecca's problems with resources that would barely register as an expense in the ranch's annual budget. but he'd learned enough about Rebecca in one conversation to know she wouldn't accept charity, wouldn't want her problems solved by a stranger's wealth, wouldn't trust anything that came too easily after a lifetime of learning that easy gifts carried hidden costs. If he was going to help her, it would have to be done carefully, indirectly, in ways that preserved her dignity and didn't raise suspicions about Michael O'Connor's impossible resources. The second Sunday found them at the same spot, the familiarity creating an intimacy that hadn't existed before. Rebecca arrived with her laundry, and a question that suggested she'd been thinking about their previous conversation all week. "Tell me about Boston. What was it like living in a city that big?" Christopher crafted his response from truth and careful omission, describing the Harvard campus, where he'd studied law without mentioning that he'd been a student, rather than observing from outside the gates. He talked about the docks where Irish immigrants labored the tenements, where families of 8 crowded into rooms meant for 2, the sharp division between the wealthy neighborhoods on Beacon Hill and the working districts that sprawled along the waterfront. He made himself a dock worker who'd been clever enough to find warehouse work, who'd saved money and dreamed of something better until economic collapse stole that future. Rebecca listened with the focused attention of someone encountering a world she'd only imagined, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and the limitations of an education curtailed by poverty and circumstance. Christopher found himself enjoying the conversation in ways he hadn't enjoyed socializing since before Stephanie's betrayal, found pleasure in Rebecca's quick understanding, in the way she made connections between ideas without needing every detail explained. "You talk different sometimes." The observation came carefully, without accusation, but Christopher felt his pulse quicken. "Different how?" "Your accent slips. Words come out wrong for Ireland, right for somewhere else. And you use words that workers don't usually use. Yesterday you said allocated when you meant given. Nobody says allocated." Christopher forced himself to relax, to laugh, as if the observation amused rather than alarmed him. "Picked up some fancy talking from the warehouse owner. Man liked to hear himself speak, used big words to sound important. Guess some of it stuck." Rebecca's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it pass, turning the conversation to safer topics. They talked about Montana, about the way seasons changed in this high country, about the small pleasures that made harsh lives bearable. And Christopher learned that Rebecca had never been more than 20 miles from the ranch, that her entire world consisted of this valley and the mountains that ringed it, that travel was a luxury reserved for people with money and freedom she'd never possessed. The third Sunday arrived with clouds building over the western peaks, promising rain that wouldn't arrive until evening. Rebecca came to the creek carrying not just laundry, but attention that made her movements sharp and anxious. Christopher waited for her to speak first, sensing that whatever troubled her needed to emerge at its own pace. Finally, she set down her washing and turned to face him directly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Christopher's stomach clenched, certain she was about to demand answers about his identity, about the discrepancies she'd noticed in his speech and bearing. He prepared explanations that would sound plausible without being outright lies, braced himself for the moment when his careful construction would crack and reveal the man hiding beneath. "Did you leave money under my door 2 weeks ago?" The question caught him completely off guard. He'd been so careful, waiting until the middle of the night, when everyone slept, slipping the envelope under the gap at the bottom of her door and retreating before anyone could see. He'd convinced himself the darkness and caution had made him invisible. Rebecca watched his face, reading the answer before he could formulate words. "It was you. $30. Exactly what I needed for 3 months of my mother's medicine." Christopher's mind raced through possible explanations, discarding each as inadequate. "How did you know?" "Because nobody else in this camp has money to spare, and nobody else would care enough to help, even if they did. It had to be either you or a miracle, and I stopped believing in miracles 3 years ago when my father got convicted." She stepped closer, and Christopher saw anger mixing with confusion in her expression. "Where did an Irish dock worker get $30 to give away? That's more than most people here make in a year. Either you're lying about who you are or you stole it, and I can't decide which possibility disturbs me more." The moment of truth arrived faster than Christopher had anticipated, forcing a choice between maintaining his cover and losing Rebecca's trust entirely. He chose a middle-path truth mixed with continued deception. "I'm not a thief. The money came from savings, from years of careful living and putting away every penny I could spare. When I saw what you were dealing with, what your mother needed, it seemed like savings were meant for exactly that kind of emergency." "That's a very expensive emergency for someone you barely know." "Maybe I'm a terrible judge of value. Maybe I think some things matter more than money." Rebecca studied him with an intensity that made Christopher feel exposed, as if she could see through skin and bone to the lies underneath. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both warning and something that might have been hope. "I don't know who you really are, Michael O'Connor. I don't think you're who you claim to be. But I took the money because my mother needed it more than I needed answers. Just know that I'm watching you, and if I find out you're playing some kind of game with me, using me for some purpose I don't understand, there won't be enough distance in Montana to keep you safe from my anger." "Fair enough." She returned to her laundry, and they worked in silence, heavier than before. But when she left, she paused long enough to say the words Christopher hadn't realized he'd been hoping to hear. "Thank you, for my mother, for caring when you didn't have to." The fourth Sunday transformed their relationship into something neither quite knew how to name. They sat closer now, their shoulders occasionally brushing in ways that sent electricity through Christopher's nerves. Rebecca laughed at a story he told about a warehouse mishap, and the sound of it felt like discovering music after years of silence. They talked about small things and large things, about dreams deferred and hopes that refused to die, despite everything that tried to kill them. Christopher found himself falling, could feel the ground disappearing beneath his feet in ways that terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. This wasn't the calculated courtship he'd pursued. With Stephanie wasn't based on social compatibility or family alliances or any of the practical considerations that were supposed to govern such things. This was something rawer and more real, born from shared moments beside cold water, from recognizing in another person the kind of strength and goodness that couldn't be faked or purchased. But the lie sat between them like a stone growing heavier with each conversation, each moment of connection built on foundations he knew were false. Rebecca thought he was Michael O'Connor, a poor Irish immigrant who'd sacrificed his savings for a stranger's need. Christopher was falling in love with a woman who had no idea that the man sitting beside her owned everything she could see, who could solve her problems with a signature but couldn't reveal that power without admitting 3 weeks of calculated deception. Every Sunday by that creek, Christopher fell deeper in love, but every Sunday the weight of his lie grew heavier. Edward found Christopher after dinner on a Tuesday, pulling him aside with the casual discretion of someone who'd learned to have important conversations without attracting attention. The old man led him behind the tool shed where shadows provided privacy from Gary's watchful eyes. "You asked about Jonathan Morgan, about why I believe he's innocent." Christopher nodded, grateful for information he couldn't request without revealing too much interest. Jonathan was smart, careful, honest to a fault. Worked those transport routes for 15 years without a single complaint. Then Ronald Flowers expanded his operation, started moving cattle through the same territories Jonathan covered. Amounts didn't match up cattle that were supposed to arrive at market, but somehow vanished before the counts were finalized. Jonathan noticed, started keeping his own records comparing what he transported to what the manifests claimed arrived. Edward paused, checking to ensure they remained alone. "He told me once, maybe 2 weeks before the accusation came, that someone was using the legitimate cattle transport to hide theft on a massive scale. Said he had evidence, was planning to take it to the territorial marshal. Then Gary Webb, who'd been working for Flowers, suddenly showed up here claiming he wanted a change of scenery. Week after that, Jonathan got arrested for stealing 50 head of cattle that 3 witnesses swore they saw him loading in the middle of the night. The pattern was clear enough that even circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture. Ronald Flowers had been running a cattle theft operation using legitimate transport routes to move stolen livestock. Jonathan had discovered the scheme and been framed before he could expose it. Gary had been the instrument of that framing, rewarded with the foreman position at Whispering Pines, where he could continue the same operation under Christopher's unwitting authority. "You think Gary's still stealing?" Edward's laugh carried no humor. "Think, son, I know it for certain. Seen him moving cattle at night, seen wagons come and go that aren't in any official record. But knowing and proving are different things, and proving gets a man fired or worse." Christopher filed the information away, adding it to the evidence accumulating in his hidden notebook. But he also understood that Edward was taking a risk by sharing this, that trust had been extended in the hope that Michael O'Connor might be someone who'd actually do something with dangerous knowledge. "Why tell me this?" "Because you're different. You work like a man who knows what hard labor costs, but you talk like someone who's seen the inside of a courtroom. You watch Gary the way a hunter watches prey, not the way a worker watches a boss. And you care about Rebecca Morgan, which means you care about justice, because nobody cares about that girl without believing her father got railroaded." The old man's perception was sharper than Christopher had credited. He'd thought his disguise was better than it was, thought he'd hidden his true nature beneath accent and calluses, but Edward had seen through the performance to something underneath, had recognized that Michael O'Connor wasn't quite what he claimed to be. "Be careful, son. Gary's suspicious of you already. Seen him watching you, watch him. Man like that, he's got no conscience about removing problems." Christopher felt the warning settle into his bones. He'd been so focused on gathering evidence that he hadn't considered how his attention might be painting a target on his own back. Remaining invisible required more than costume and accent. It required becoming truly insignificant, truly beneath notice. But it was already too late for that. Gary had noticed, and Gary was not a man who tolerated threats to his comfortable corruption. The confrontation arrived on a Saturday night when exhaustion and heat had shortened everyone's temper. Christopher couldn't sleep, his body too accustomed to the rhythm of waking before dawn to accept the gift of extended rest. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb the other men, and walked out into air that had finally cooled after a day that had felt like breathing fire. Movement near the north fence caught his attention. Christopher moved toward it without thinking, staying in shadows, watching as Gary directed two men loading cattle onto wagons by lamplight. The foreman's voice carried across the distance, giving instructions that made Christopher's hands ball into fists. 20 head tonight. Tell Flowers I'll have 50 ready by month's end. And make sure the money's in gold. None of that paper currency that loses value crossing state lines. One of the men responded in a voice too low to catch, but Gary's laugh was loud enough. The owner, that Boston fool, doesn't know cattle from horses. Signs whatever I put in front of him, too busy playing gentleman rancher to notice what's happening under his nose. By the time he figures out something's wrong, I'll have enough put away to buy my own spread and leave him with an empty ranch and his inheritance spent. Christopher watched the transaction complete, watched money change hands and cattle disappear into wagons that wouldn't appear in any official record. He memorized faces, noted the brand on the cattle, counted the animals being stolen under his authority, and sold to the man his brother wanted him to ally with through marriage. He stayed hidden until the wagons departed, until Gary returned to his quarters, until the night reclaimed its silence. Only then did Christopher emerge from shadows, his mind working through implications that reached further than simple theft. This wasn't opportunistic crime. This was systematic, organized, protected by connections that extended to Ronald Flowers and likely beyond. And if Edward was right about Jonathan Morgan discovering a similar operation 3 years ago, then the same network that had framed an innocent man might not hesitate to eliminate another threat if Michael O'Connor started asking too many questions. Wednesday brought rain that turned the fields to mud and made labor twice as hard for half the progress. Men slipped and cursed tools stuck in ground that clung like glue, and tempers frayed under the assault of water that soaked through clothes and made every movement a battle against discomfort. Gary rode through the mess on his horse, shouting criticism that solved nothing and made everything worse. Rebecca worked in the potato field sorting harvest, despite conditions that would have justified stopping. Christopher watched her from his section, saw how rain plastered hair to her face, how she kept working with the same methodical precision even as others around her gave up and waited for weather to improve. There was something magnificent in her refusal to yield something that made Christopher's chest ache with admiration, and the growing certainty that he was completely, irrevocably in love with a woman who thought he was someone he wasn't. Gary reined his horse beside Rebecca's section, and Christopher felt his body tense before the foreman even spoke. The pattern had become familiar over the past weeks. Gary targeted Rebecca with a frequency and viciousness that went beyond mere cruelty into something that looked like personal vendetta. Christopher had watched it happen again and again, had swallowed his rage each time, had reminded himself that revealing his authority prematurely would undermine everything he'd come to accomplish. But there were limits to how much a man could swallow before choking. "Rebecca Morgan, your work is sloppy again. Half these potatoes are damaged from careless handling." Christopher could see Rebecca's baskets from where he stood. Every potato was intact, sorted with a care that exceeded anyone else's standard. Gary was lying, and everyone within earshot knew it. "I'm docking you another week's rations. Maybe hunger will teach you the quality control your father never bothered to instill." Rebecca's hands stilled in the mud. She looked up at Gary, and Christopher saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear or resignation, but anger barely restrained, the kind that comes from being pushed past the point where submission seems possible. "My father taught me honest work, which is more than some men learned." The words came out quiet but clear, and the field around them went silent. Workers stopped their own labor to watch, shocked that Rebecca had dared to speak back, certain this would end badly. Gary's face darkened, his hand moving to the whip at his saddle. Christopher found himself moving before conscious thought engaged, crossing the distance between his section and Rebecca's, positioning himself where Gary couldn't reach her without going through him first. "Beggin' your pardon, sir, but Miss Rebecca's work is perfect. Best in the field, if I'm any judge. Perhaps there's been some mistake." Gary's attention swiveled to Christopher, like a gun finding a new target. "And who asked for your opinion, O'Connor?" "Nobody, sir, just observing what's plain to see." "What's plain to see is that you're defending a thief's daughter, which makes me wonder about your own character. Maybe I should be checking your bunk for missing property." The threat hung between them, and Christopher understood he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By defending Rebecca publicly, he'd marked himself as worthy of Gary's focused attention, had invited the same systematic destruction that had been directed at her for 3 years. James appeared at Christopher's elbow, his voice urgent and low. "Don't make this worse. She's not worth losing your position." But Christopher couldn't retreat, couldn't watch Rebecca face Gary's anger alone, couldn't let injustice happen in front of him while he preserved his disguise through cowardly silence. Some things mattered more than strategy, more than careful investigation, more than the slow accumulation of evidence. Some things required a man to stand up and be counted, even when standing up meant everything else might fall apart. "I'm just saying what anyone with eyes can see, sir. Rebecca's work is beyond reproach." Gary's whip came off the saddle, and for a moment Christopher thought the foreman might actually strike him in front of everyone. Instead, Gary smiled, a cold expression that promised consequences delivered at a more convenient time. "Brave words for a man who's been here less than a month. Let's see how brave you are when you're looking for work somewhere else. Both of you report to my office after dinner. We'll discuss the terms of your dismissal." He rode away, leaving Christopher and Rebecca standing in the rain while whispers spread through the field like fire through dry grass. James grabbed Christopher's arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "You fool! You've destroyed yourself for nothing. Gary will blacklist you across the territory. No ranch will hire you after this." Christopher looked at Rebecca, saw the mixture of gratitude and guilt in her expression, saw her understand that he'd sacrificed his position for her sake. He wanted to tell her not to feel guilty that he could survive Gary's dismissal because he owned the ranch and could reverse the decision with a single conversation. But telling her that would require explaining everything else, would force him to admit that Michael O'Connor was a fiction and their entire relationship was built on lies. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice pitched for Christopher's ears alone. "Why did you do that? You'll have nothing now." Because watching injustice happen and doing nothing makes a man complicit. Because you deserved someone to speak up for you. Because some things matter more than keeping a job. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the truth beneath the words, trying to understand what kind of man would throw away his livelihood for a principle. Christopher held her gaze, willing her to see him, to understand that whatever name he used, whatever disguise he wore, the person standing before her was real in the ways that mattered. "Who are you, Michael O'Connor? Really?" The question hung between them like a door waiting to be opened. Christopher stood on the threshold, knowing that walking through meant revealing everything, ending the investigation before he had enough evidence to ensure Gary and Ronald Flowers faced real consequences, possibly destroying whatever fragile connection he'd built with Rebecca when she learned he'd been lying to her from the moment they met. He opened his mouth, the truth forming on his tongue. Then Gary's voice cut through the rain-soaked air, sharp with malicious pleasure. "All workers, stop what you're doing and assemble in the yard immediately. I have an announcement regarding theft that affects everyone." Christopher felt his blood turn to ice. Gary had moved faster than expected, had decided to eliminate the threat Rebecca and Michael posed before they could cause more trouble. Whatever the foreman had planned, it wouldn't be subtle, and it wouldn't be fair. They walked toward the yard with the other workers, Rebecca's hand finding Christopher's in the rain, her grip tight with fear and something that might have been trust. Christopher squeezed back a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, a reassurance that felt like another lie. The assembly took shape in the muddy space between buildings, workers clustering together while rain continued its assault from skies that showed no sign of mercy. Gary stood on a platform normally used for equipment demonstrations, 5 heavy sacks visible beside him, their contents spilling out to reveal premium grain that should have been locked in storage. Christopher's stomach dropped. He knew what was coming, could see the trap closing, even as Gary's mouth opened to spring it. "Earlier today, I conducted a routine inspection of the storage facilities. What I discovered was theft on a scale that threatens this entire operation. 5 sacks of seed grain worth more than most of you will earn in a year missing from locked storage. After extensive investigation, I found these sacks hidden behind the women's quarters." He let the implications settle, watched the crowd react with the mixture of shock and satisfaction that always accompanied another person's downfall. Then Gary's finger extended, pointing directly at Rebecca with the certainty of an executioner identifying his target. "Rebecca Morgan, step forward." Rebecca's hand tightened on Christopher's, but she released it and moved through the crowd with the dignity of someone who'd been condemned so many times that the process held no more fear. She stood before Gary, alone and exposed, while rain ran down her face like tears she refused to shed. "Your father was a thief who stole from the ranch that employed him. Like father, like daughter, the saying goes. I should have known better than to give you a chance. Should have recognized that bad blood breeds bad behavior." Christopher pushed forward, his voice cutting through the rain. "She didn't take those sacks. I've watched her every day for 3 weeks. She works her section, tends to her mother, and sleeps, nothing else. Someone planted that grain to frame her." Gary's smile widened, predatory and pleased. And how would you know her movements so intimately, O'Connor? Unless you've been watching her for purposes that have nothing to do with honest observation. Perhaps you're her accomplice. Perhaps two thieves found each other and thought they could rob blind the ranch that gave them both employment. The crowd shifted, uncertain now, looking between Rebecca and Christopher and Gary, with the confused attention of people trying to determine where truth lived in a situation built entirely from lies. Christopher saw the trap fully now. Understood that Gary had constructed this scenario to eliminate both Rebecca and the man who dared to defend her, to make their dismissal seem like justice rather than persecution. He had one choice left, one card that could end this immediately, that could protect Rebecca from consequences she didn't deserve and expose Gary's corruption in front of everyone. All he had to do was speak his real name, reveal his identity, use the authority he'd been hiding for 3 weeks. But doing so would mean admitting to Rebecca that he'd lied to her from the beginning, that Michael O'Connor was a fiction, and the man she'd been confiding in, laughing with, maybe beginning to care for, didn't actually exist. It would mean destroying whatever trust they'd built, replacing it with the knowledge that even the good things in her life had been predicated on deception. Christopher looked at Rebecca, standing in the rain, her expression showing not fear, but weary acceptance of another injustice she lacked the power to prevent. He thought about his uncle's belief that masters should be distant and unknown, about how that distance had allowed Gary's corruption to flourish, about how his own fear of being loved for money rather than merit had led him to create a situation where the woman he loved didn't even know his real name. The greatest wealth isn't land or gold, he realized. It's finding someone who loves you in work clothes as much as Sunday best, who sees your soul before your bank account. And that required honesty, required vulnerability, required being willing to lose everything for the chance at something real. Christopher opened his mouth to speak the truth that would change everything, prepared to sacrifice his investigation and possibly Rebecca's regard in exchange for the immediate protection his name could provide. Then Rebecca's voice cut through the rain, steady and clear, and aimed directly at Gary with a force that made the foreman flinch. "I've never stolen anything in my life. Neither did my father, but you know that already, don't you, Gary? You know exactly who the real thieves are in this valley." The challenge hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike, and Christopher understood that the moment for choosing had arrived. Reveal himself now, or watch Rebecca face Gary's wrath without the protection his identity could provide. Save her with the truth, or honor her defiance by standing beside her as Michael O'Connor, powerless but present. He chose presence over power, standing beside Rebecca in the rain, while Gary's face darkened with rage, while the crowd held its breath, while the future hung suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Whatever came next, whatever consequences fell from this confrontation, Christopher would face them, as the man Rebecca thought she knew would preserve her right to know him as something other than wealth and property, before revealing the truth that would force her to reassess everything. Even if it cost him everything he'd come to protect, Gary's rage transformed his features into something ugly and dangerous, the veneer of authority cracking to reveal the petty cruelty underneath. He stepped down from the platform, moving toward Rebecca with deliberate menace, while the assembled workers shifted uncomfortably witnesses to injustice they lacked the power to prevent. You dare accuse me, you, the daughter of a convicted criminal standing in mud, wearing clothes paid for by the ranch's charity, have the audacity to question my integrity. Rebecca didn't flinch, didn't step back, and Christopher felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. She stood her ground with the courage of someone who'd lost everything already and had nothing left to fear. I question the integrity of any man who frames innocent people to hide his own crimes. My father discovered your operation with Ronald Flowers, and you destroyed him before he could expose it. Now you're trying to do the same to me because I'm inconvenient, because I won't disappear quietly like you hoped. The crowd's murmur rose in volume, shock rippling through workers who were beginning to see patterns they'd previously dismissed as coincidence. Gary's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt, and Christopher understood with cold clarity that the foreman was desperate enough to do something violent, something that couldn't be undone. Christopher's voice cut through the tension, no longer carrying the Irish lilt he'd maintained for 3 weeks, reverting to the educated Boston accent that was his birthright. "That's enough, Gary. This ends now." The change in his speech made everyone freeze. Workers who'd known Michael O'Connor as an Irish immigrant stared at him with confused recognition, trying to reconcile the accent with the face, the bearing with the rags. Gary's eyes narrowed, suspicion blooming into something close to understanding. "Who the hell are you?" Christopher reached into his shirt and pulled out the heavy gold signet ring he'd kept hidden on a leather cord around his neck, the ring bearing the Hayes family crest that was recognized by every banker, lawyer, and lawman in Montana Territory. He held it high where the rain-dimmed light could catch the metal, where everyone assembled could see the proof of authority he'd been concealing. "My name is Christopher Hayes. I own Whispering Pines Ranch. I own every acre. You can see every building in this valley and every position of employment, including yours." The silence that followed felt thick enough to drown in. Workers stared, their expressions cycling through disbelief, shock, recognition. Gary's face went through a similar progression, landing on fear as he realized the carefully constructed empire of theft he'd built over 15 years was crumbling in real time. "I've lived among you for 3 weeks as Michael O'Connor, not because I enjoyed deception, but because I needed to understand what was happening on my land, needed evidence of corruption that couldn't be explained away or hidden behind doctored ledgers. And what I found was systematic theft, cruelty, and injustice operating under my name and my authority." Christopher turned his gaze on Gary, and all the rage he'd been suppressing for weeks poured into his voice. "You've been stealing from this ranch since before my uncle died, skimming wages, selling supplies, moving cattle at night to Ronald Flowers and pocketing the profits. You've created a culture of fear and suffering while claiming to manage in my interests. And worst of all, you participated in framing Jonathan Morgan, an innocent man, to protect Ronald Flowers' criminal operation." Gary's hand finally closed on his pistol, but before he could draw it, Edward stepped forward with surprising speed for a man of 72, his own weathered hands catching Gary's wrist in a grip that looked gentle but held firm. "I wouldn't, son. You're already finished. Don't make it worse by adding violence to the list." The foreman's resistance collapsed like a structure with its foundation removed. He sagged the pistol, falling from nerveless fingers into mud, his expression showing the desperate calculation of a man searching for escape routes and finding none. Christopher became aware of Rebecca staring at him with an expression that made his heart crack. Not relief, not gratitude, but betrayal so profound it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. Her lips moved, forming words that came out broken and raw. You've been lying to me. Every word, every moment, every Sunday by that creek, all of it was a lie. Rebecca, let me explain. Explain what? That you're not Michael O'Connor, that you're not a poor immigrant, that you're actually the owner of this ranch, the man who could have stopped my suffering at any moment, but chose instead to play dress-up and gather evidence while I went hungry and my mother died by 10 inches. The accusations hit harder than any physical blow could have. Christopher stepped toward her desperate to make her understand, but Rebecca backed away as if his proximity caused pain. I had to know the truth, had to see with my own eyes what was happening. If I'd come down here as Christopher Hayes, Gary would have hidden everything and the corruption would have continued. So instead, you hid yourself. You became someone else, someone I thought I could trust, someone who understood what it meant to have nothing. You let me confide in you. Let me believe you were like me. Let me think. Her voice broke and she pressed her hand over her mouth, as if physically holding back words that would reveal too much. Christopher saw tears mixing with rain on her face, saw the careful walls she'd built to protect herself shattering under the weight of this new betrayal. You let me care about someone who doesn't even exist. The truth of it landed like a knife between his ribs. Michael O'Connor, the man Rebecca had been falling for, was a fiction Christopher had created for investigative purposes. But the person underneath the man who'd sat beside her at the creek and listened to her pain and fallen completely in love with her courage and kindness, that man was real in every way that mattered. Michael was me. It is me. The name was false, but everything else was true. My feelings for you, my admiration, the way I... Don't you dare tell me what you feel when you've been lying about who you are since the moment we met. She turned away, heading toward the women's quarters with steps that looked like they required tremendous effort. Christopher started to follow, but Kenneth appeared from the direction of the main house, summoned by a worker who'd run to fetch him the moment Christopher revealed himself. His older brother took in the scene with a glance that captured everything, his expression settling into grim satisfaction. So your experiment is over. I assume you have evidence to justify this theatrical production. Christopher pulled the notebook from his pocket, handed it to Kenneth, along with terse instructions to secure Gary immediately and send for the territorial sheriff. His brother accepted the materials with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been managing crises his entire adult life, already organizing workers to restrain Gary and secure the foreman's quarters for search. Christopher tried again to reach Rebecca, but she'd vanished into the women's bunkhouse, and Edward positioned himself outside the door with the unmistakable air of a guardian who would not be moved. Give her time, son. That girl's been hurt by too many people in too many ways. Finding out the one person she was starting to trust wasn't who he claimed to be, that's going to take more than an explanation to heal. I never meant to hurt her. Edward's expression softened marginally. I believe you, but good intentions don't erase the damage when the road they pave leads to pain. You did what you thought was right for the ranch for justice, but you forgot that real people get caught in the machinery of even righteous plans. The old man was right. Christopher had been so focused on gathering evidence, on ensuring Gary and Ronald Flowers faced consequences, that he'd failed to fully consider how Rebecca would feel when the truth emerged. He'd told himself he was protecting her by not revealing his identity prematurely, but protection looked a lot like manipulation when viewed from her perspective. Sheriff Coleman arrived within the hour, a lean man of 50, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for fairness that had survived decades of political pressure. He listened to Christopher's account while examining the notebook, his expression growing progressively darker as he absorbed evidence of theft on a scale that exceeded simple employee malfeasance and entered the realm of organized crime. Gary, secured in his own office under guard, initially attempted bluster and denial. But Kenneth had searched the foreman's quarters and found cash hidden in amounts that exceeded any legitimate source, along with correspondence from Ronald Flowers that detailed their arrangement with damning specificity. Faced with evidence that couldn't be explained away, Gary's resistance crumbled into the desperate bargaining of a man trying to minimize consequences. "I'll testify against Flowers, give you everything you need to convict him. Just don't send me to the territorial prison. You don't know what they do to men like me in those places." Sheriff Coleman's expression showed the contempt of a lawman who'd seen too many criminals beg for mercy they'd never shown their victims. "You participated in framing Jonathan Morgan, an innocent man who spent 3 years in that same prison. You stole from workers who couldn't afford to lose a single penny. You created a system of suffering and called it management. Whatever happens to you is justice, not cruelty." Among Gary's papers, Kenneth found something that made his face go pale. He handed the document to Christopher without speaking, letting his younger brother read for himself the letter that explained so much. The paper was 3 years old, yellowed slightly, but still legible, written in Ronald Flowers's distinctive hand. "Gary, the driver, Jonathan Morgan, has become a problem. He's noticed discrepancies in the transport manifests and has started keeping independent records. If he takes this information to authorities, our entire operation collapses and we both face prison. Frame him for cattle theft before he can act. I'll provide 3 witnesses who will testify to seeing him load my cattle onto his wagon at night. Make sure the story is airtight, the evidence convincing. I'm authorizing $2,000 for this service to be paid upon Morgan's conviction. After this is handled, I'm moving you to Whispering Pines Ranch. John Hayes is failing, and his nephew knows nothing about ranch management. You'll have free rein to continue our operation under more favorable circumstances. Destroy this letter after reading. R. Flowers." Christopher read it twice, rage building with each word. This wasn't just theft or corruption. This was conspiracy to commit fraud, to destroy an innocent man's life, to pervert justice for profit. And Ronald Flowers, the man Kenneth had been pressuring Christopher to ally with through marriage, was the architect of a criminal enterprise that had devastated Rebecca's family. Sheriff Coleman studied the letter with the focused attention of someone recognizing case-making evidence. "This is enough to arrest Flowers. Combined with Gary's testimony and your observations of the cattle shipments, we can build a prosecution that will stand." Christopher felt no satisfaction, only cold determination to see justice completed. He provided detailed accounts of the night he'd witnessed Gary selling cattle to Flowers' men, handed over the records he'd kept documenting systematic theft, corroborated everything with testimony from Edward and other workers who'd been afraid to speak before, but found courage now that someone with power was listening. By nightfall, Gary was in chains, his possessions inventoried, his crimes catalogued, with the thoroughness of legal proceedings that would culminate in a trial. Sheriff Coleman prepared to ride for the Flowers Ranch at dawn, armed with evidence and authority to arrest one of the most powerful men in Montana Territory. But Christopher felt none of the triumph that should have accompanied such victory. His mind kept returning to Rebecca's face when she'd understood his deception, to the way she'd looked at him like he'd become a stranger wearing a familiar mask, to the knowledge that he'd wounded someone who'd already been hurt too many times. He walked to the women's quarters after dark, hoping Edward might have relented, hoping Rebecca might be willing to at least hear his explanation. But the old man remained at his post, immovable as stone. "She's been crying. Best I can tell, she's been crying since the assembly ended. You think adding more words to the pile is going to help? I need her to understand why I did it." Edward's laugh carried no humor. "Son, she understands why you did it. That's not the problem. The problem is you chose your investigation over her trust, chose gathering evidence over honesty. You had chances to tell her the truth every Sunday by that creek, and you kept choosing the lie instead." The accuracy stung worse than any rebuke. Christopher had told himself he was protecting the investigation, protecting Rebecca from information she might accidentally reveal, protecting himself from the vulnerability of being known. But underneath all those justifications lived fear, the same fear Stephanie had planted 3 years ago. The terror that showing his true self would reveal him as unworthy of love. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never meant to cause her pain." "Tell her yourself when she's ready to hear it." Christopher returned to the main house for the first time in 3 weeks, climbing the trail that led from suffering to comfort, from truth to the comfortable distance he'd maintained before conscience drove him down into the reality of his own property. The house felt foreign now, too large and too quiet. Decorated with luxuries that seemed obscene after weeks of sleeping on canvas and eating thin soup. Kathleen found him in the study, standing at the window that overlooked the valley, staring down at lights from the worker quarters that looked like distant stars. "I heard what happened. Kenneth says you exposed Gary's corruption, that the sheriff is going after Ronald Flowers tomorrow." "I did? Then why do you look like you lost instead of won?" Christopher turned from the window, and whatever Kathleen saw in his face made her expression shift from curiosity to concern. "I fell in love with her, with Rebecca Morgan, and I destroyed any chance we might have had by lying to her about who I was." Kathleen moved to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and handed one to Christopher before settling into the chair across from his desk. "Tell me everything." He did. The words poured out in a torrent describing 3 weeks of labor and observation, Sunday conversations by the creek, the gradual recognition that Rebecca Morgan was everything Stephanie Ashford had pretended to be: brave and kind and genuine, capable of tremendous strength, despite circumstances that would have broken lesser people, possessing a dignity that wealth and education couldn't purchase and poverty couldn't diminish. Kathleen listened without interruption, her face showing the complicated emotions of someone who'd watched Christopher grow from boy to man, who'd witnessed Stephanie's betrayal and the damage it caused, who understood both why he'd created the Michael O'Connor disguise and why that disguise had ultimately wounded someone innocent. When he finished, she set down her glass with careful precision. "Do you remember what you told Kenneth when he was pushing you to marry Nicole Flowers? You said you wouldn't marry without love, that you needed someone who could see past your wealth to your authentic self." I remember. Rebecca saw exactly that. She saw a man who was kind when kindness was dangerous, who stood up for the weak, who sacrificed his position to defend her against injustice. She saw you stripped of wealth and property and family name, saw the person underneath all those external things, and that person was good enough, worthy enough, that she was starting to care despite every lesson life had taught her about trusting people. Christopher felt the truth of it settle into his bones. But I built that connection on lies. You built it on partial truth. The name was false, the poverty was performance, but the man who sat beside her at that creek, who listened to her pain and offered comfort, who couldn't stand watching her being treated unjustly, that man was real. That was you, Christopher, not a disguise, not a character you were playing. The most honest version of yourself you've been since Stephanie made you afraid to be vulnerable. He wanted to believe. It wanted to think Rebecca might eventually see past the deception to the genuine feelings underneath. But the memory of her face when she'd looked at him with betrayal in her eyes suggested forgiveness wouldn't come easily or quickly. What do I do? Kathleen stood moving to the window where Christopher had been standing, looking down at the same distant lights. You give her time. You clear her father's name, which is the only justice that will truly matter to her. You fix the problems you found in your ranch. Prove that your time as Michael O'Connor changed you into the kind of owner your uncle would be proud of. And then, when she's ready, you tell her the truth about everything. Not the truth she needs to hear to forgive you, but the truth about who you are, what you feel, and why you made the choices you made. It was good advice, the kind that acknowledged complexity instead of offering easy solutions. Christopher poured himself another whiskey and settled in to wait for morning, when Sheriff Coleman would ride for the Flowers Ranch and the next phase of justice would begin. Dawn arrived with crystalline clarity, the rain having washed the world clean and left behind air so pure it hurt to breathe. Christopher watched from the study window as Sheriff Coleman departed with 3 deputies, all armed and carrying warrants that would either end Ronald Flowers's criminal enterprise or trigger violence that could end very differently. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, already dressed for a day of legal work that would involve reorganizing the ranch's entire management structure. The workers are asking about their wages, want to know if the changes you promised last night were real or just something you said in the moment. Christopher turned from the window, grateful for concrete problems that had concrete solutions. Every worker gets the wages I authorized originally, $15 a month, backdated to when I took ownership. Calculate what they're owed and have cash ready for distribution by this evening. Kenneth's eyebrows rose. That's thousands of dollars. The ranch accounts can handle it, but it'll require significant liquidity transfers. Then make the transfers. These people have been robbed for years under my authority. Making them whole is the minimum acceptable response." His brother nodded, making notes in the ledger he carried everywhere, already calculating figures and organizing the logistics of mass payment. "What about Rebecca Morgan?" The question made Christopher's chest tighten. "What about her?" "She's owed wages, too, but more than that, her father is owed justice. Gary's testimony will help, but the letter from Flowers is what will actually free Jonathan Morgan. Are you planning to handle that personally?" Christopher hadn't thought that far ahead, had been so focused on surviving the immediate aftermath of revelation that he hadn't considered the mechanics of clearing an innocent man's name. "I'll take the evidence to the territorial governor myself. Today, if possible. Jonathan Morgan shouldn't spend one more day in prison for crimes he didn't commit." Kenneth's expression softened into something approaching approval. "That's the right call. But Christopher, be prepared for the fact that freeing her father might not be enough. That girl's trust was broken pretty thoroughly. Justice for her family won't automatically heal what your deception damaged." The advice echoed what Kathleen had said, what Edward had implied, what Christopher's own heart understood. Some wounds couldn't be mended quickly. Some trust couldn't be restored through grand gestures. Sometimes the only path forward was patience and the hope that time might accomplish what immediate action could not. Sheriff Coleman returned as the sun reached its peak, his face showing the grim satisfaction of a lawman who'd successfully arrested a dangerous criminal. Ronald Flowers sat on a horse with his hands bound, his expression cycling between outrage and calculation, already planning the legal defense that might save him from prison. His daughter Nicole rode beside him, her face pale but composed, and when she saw Christopher standing on the porch of the main house, she guided her horse in his direction. The sheriff allowed it, perhaps recognizing that some conversations needed to happen regardless of legal proceedings. Nicole dismounted with practiced grace, and Christopher was struck by how much she resembled her father in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the bearing that came from a lifetime of wealth and privilege. "I assume you know what he did. To Jonathan Morgan, to your ranch, to all the families his operation destroyed." Christopher nodded, uncertain what this woman wanted from him beyond acknowledgement of her father's crimes. "I didn't know. My father kept his business separate from family matters, and I never questioned where the money came from or how he maintained his position. I should have. Ignorance doesn't excuse complicity." The self-awareness surprised him. Christopher had expected defensiveness, justification, the kind of protective anger children often displayed when their parents faced consequences. "What will you do?" Nicole's laugh was bitter. "Sell the ranch, pay restitution to everyone my father harmed, try to build something new from the wreckage of his reputation, and never ever accept another marriage proposal based on property consolidation rather than genuine feeling." The last part was aimed directly at Christopher. Acknowledgement of Kenneth's failed matchmaking and perhaps relief that both of them had escaped a union that would have been built on the same corruption that destroyed her father. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry you have to carry this burden. And I'm sorry your investigation required you to deceive people who trusted you. We're all paying for the sins of our fathers, whether those sins were active crimes or passive negligence that allowed crimes to flourish." She remounted and rode back to the sheriff's custody, leaving Christopher to absorb the uncomfortable truth that his uncle's distance and his own initial unwillingness to engage directly with ranch management, had created the conditions where Gary's corruption could thrive. He'd inherited not just property, but responsibility for systems that had failed under inadequate oversight. The territorial governor received Christopher that same afternoon, his office in the capital furnished with the heavy formality of government authority. Christopher laid out the evidence, methodically presenting Gary's confession, Ronald Flowers's letter, his own observations testimony from workers who'd witnessed theft and framing. The governor listened with the grave attention of someone who understood that miscarriages of justice undermined the entire legal system's credibility. Jonathan Morgan will be released immediately and provided with a full pardon. The territorial government will also issue a public statement acknowledging the injustice and apologizing for the failure of our courts to prevent it. Relief flooded through Christopher, followed quickly by the recognition that freeing Rebecca's father was only the first step in a much longer process of making amends. I'd like to be present when he's released, to personally deliver the news and offer restitution for the years he lost. The governor's expression showed approval. That's appropriate. The prison is 2 days' ride north. I'll send a rider ahead with release papers so Morgan can be processed immediately upon your arrival. Christopher left the capital with a lighter heart than he'd carried in weeks, heading north toward the territorial prison, with Kenneth accompanying him for legal witness. They rode hard, covering distance with the urgency of men who understood that every hour Jonathan Morgan spent behind bars was another hour of injustice multiplying. The prison sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that made escape impossible and hope difficult to maintain. Gray stone walls rose 30 feet high, topped with guard towers that watched over a population of men who'd lost their freedom for crimes both real and imagined. Christopher felt his stomach turn at the thought of Rebecca's father spending 3 years in this place for something he didn't do, 3 years stolen by men whose only crime Jonathan had committed was discovering their theft. The warden met them at the gate. The governor's release papers already processed, Jonathan Morgan already freed from the cell that had been his home since conviction. The man who walked into the warden's office looked older than 52, worn down by hard labor and injustice, but his eyes still held the clarity of someone whose conscience remained clean despite imprisonment. Christopher stood extending his hand in a gesture of respect. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Christopher Hayes, owner of Whispering Pines Ranch. I'm here to tell you that you've been pardoned, that the evidence proving your innocence has been presented to the territorial governor, and that the men who framed you are facing justice for their crimes." Jonathan stared at the offered hand, then at Christopher's face, searching for deception or cruelty or the kind of false hope that prisoners learn to recognize and reject. "Rebecca, my daughter, is she?" "She's alive and well, angry at me currently, but physically safe and employed at the ranch with full wages and housing." Something in Jonathan's expression cracked years of controlled emotion, suddenly overwhelming his defenses. He took Christopher's hand, gripping it with the strength of gratitude too large for words. "I can never repay you for this. You owe me nothing. Justice isn't a debt, it's a right that was denied to you. What I can offer is employment as head of livestock transport at Whispering Pines, fair wages, housing for your family, and medical care for your wife, if you'll accept." Jonathan's response came through tears he no longer tried to hide. I'll accept. God help me, I'll accept everything you're offering and spend the rest of my life proving I deserved your faith. The ride back to Whispering Pines took 3 days because Jonathan had been weakened by prison conditions and needed frequent rest. Christopher used the time to tell Rebecca's father everything that had happened, explaining his undercover investigation, Gary's arrest, Ronald Flower's prosecution, and the systematic changes being implemented to prevent future corruption. He also explained with careful honesty how he'd met Rebecca, how he'd fallen in love with her while pretending to be someone he wasn't, and how she currently wanted nothing to do with him. Jonathan listened with the focused attention of a man trying to understand not just events, but motivations and consequences. My daughter learned young not to trust easily. Her mother and I tried to teach her that good people existed in the world, that kindness wasn't always a trap, that hope was worth holding even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Then I got convicted, and everything we'd taught her got contradicted by reality. She built walls to protect herself, and you managed to get past those walls by presenting yourself as someone who couldn't hurt her the way wealthy men hurt poor women. Then you revealed you were exactly what she'd been taught to fear. The assessment was accurate and painful. I never meant to hurt her. I believe you, but good intentions don't erase consequences. If you want my daughter's forgiveness, you're going to have to prove that the man she met by the creek was real, that Michael O'Connor and Christopher Hayes are the same person underneath different names. That's going to take time and consistency and a willingness to be vulnerable in ways that probably terrify you. Christopher thought about Stephanie, about how her betrayal had taught him to hide his authentic self behind walls of suspicion and distance. Rebecca had seen past those walls without knowing they existed, had connected with the person underneath, had offered trust despite every reason to withhold it. And he'd repaid that trust by confirming her worst fears about wealthy men who saw poor women as objects for entertainment or experimentation. What if time and consistency aren't enough? What if the damage is permanent? Jonathan's expression turned thoughtful. Then you'll have to live with that consequence and find a way to be the man she deserved to meet, even if she never knows about it. Sometimes we don't get the happy endings we want. Sometimes we just get the opportunity to become better people through trying to earn forgiveness we might never receive. The wisdom in those words came from experience, from 3 years of maintaining innocence while the world insisted on guilt, from finding a way to stay human in conditions designed to strip away humanity. Christopher absorbed the lesson, understanding that loving Rebecca meant respecting her right to withhold forgiveness, accepting that some betrayals couldn't be overcome regardless of intention or regret. They arrived at Whispering Pines on a Sunday morning, and Christopher directed Kenneth to take Jonathan to the worker quarters while he remained at the main house, giving Rebecca the space to reunite with her father without his presence complicating the moment. Kathleen brought him reports throughout the afternoon describing how Rebecca had collapsed in her father's arms, how they'd held each other while years of accumulated pain poured out in tears, how the other workers had gathered to welcome Jonathan home and celebrate justice finally delivered. Christopher listened from his study, grateful for Rebecca's happiness and Jonathan's freedom, accepting that he'd played a role in creating that happiness while also acknowledging he'd forfeited his right to witness it directly. Some gifts were meant to be given from a distance. Some acts of restitution required the giver to step back and allow the recipients to heal without the burden of mandatory gratitude. A week passed. Christopher spent it reorganizing ranch operations, hiring a new foreman who answered directly to him rather than operating with unchecked authority, implementing systems of accountability that would prevent future corruption. He raised wages across the board, improved housing, brought in a doctor to treat workers who'd been suffering without medical care, created a school for workers' children that Kathleen agreed to oversee. Edward accepted the foreman position with gruff appreciation, understanding that Christopher wanted someone who'd proven both competence and integrity through years of quiet resistance to Gary's corruption. The old man's first act was organizing a crew to repair the women's quarters, ensuring Rebecca and the others had housing worthy of human dignity rather than grudging accommodation. Jonathan took over livestock transport with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd spent 15 years mastering every detail of the work before being wrongly imprisoned. Within 3 days, he'd identified inefficiencies in the current system and proposed changes that would save money while improving animal welfare. Christopher approved every suggestion, grateful to have someone whose judgment he could trust without reservation. Rebecca remained invisible, at least to Christopher. She worked her sections, cared for her mother in the cottage Christopher had provided near the main house, where doctors could attend her easily, and avoided any location where she might encounter the ranch's owner. Edward reported that she was healing, that reuniting with her father had lifted some of the weight she'd carried, that Angela's condition had improved significantly with proper medical treatment. But she still wouldn't speak to Christopher, wouldn't acknowledge his existence beyond what absolute necessity required, and the silence hurt worse than any accusation could have. Sunday arrived again, and Christopher found himself walking to the creek behind the property without consciously deciding to go there. Some part of him hoped Rebecca might have the same habit, might appear for their regular conversation, even though everything had changed. He waited for an hour, watching water flow over stones, remembering how she'd looked kneeling beside the creek, washing clothes, how her laugh had sounded when he had told a story that amused her, how the sunlight had caught gold in her brown hair. She didn't come. Christopher stood to leave, resignation settling over him like weight, when her voice cut through the sound of running water. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes, trying to decide whether to leave or stay." He turned slowly, afraid sudden movement might spook her into vanishing. Rebecca stood at the tree line, wearing a dress he recognized as new, her hair uncovered for the first time since he'd met her, the wariness in her expression mixing with something that might have been curiosity. "I hoped you might come, even though I have no right to hope for your presence." She moved closer, each step deliberate, stopping at the distance that had been their custom during the Sundays when Michael O'Connor had been real and Christopher Hayes had been a distant abstraction. "My father told me everything about how you went undercover to find evidence against Gary, about the letter proving Ronald Flowers framed him, about how you rode to the territorial capital and secured his release personally. He says, I should forgive you because you restored our family and brought justice when everyone else had abandoned us to injustice." Christopher heard the "but" implied in her tone, understood that Jonathan's gratitude didn't automatically transfer to his daughter. "But you don't think restoration and justice are sufficient reasons for forgiveness?" Rebecca settled onto the grass where they used to sit And, after a moment's hesitation, Christopher joined her, maintaining the careful distance she seemed to need. I spent 3 weeks opening up to you, telling you things I've never told anyone else, letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone in the world who could see me as a person rather than the daughter of a convicted criminal. And all that time you were someone else, gathering evidence, playing a role, treating me like an object of investigation rather than a human being worthy of honesty. Each word landed like a stone, accurate and painful. Christopher didn't try to defend himself, didn't offer explanations that would sound like justifications. He just listened, giving Rebecca the space to voice hurt that deserved acknowledgement. But then I spent this week thinking about every conversation we had, every moment by this creek, and I realized something that I'm not sure how to feel about. She paused, and Christopher waited, hardly breathing. You never lied about who you are, only about what you own. When I asked about your family, you told me about losing your mother young and being raised by a woman who cared for you. When I asked about your work in Boston, you described the docks and the warehouse honestly, even if you left out the part about studying law. When I asked what brought you west, you told me the truth about inheriting property and feeling obligated to manage it, even though you'd planned never to return. Christopher felt something shift in his chest, hope flickering to life despite his attempts to suppress it. The man I fell in love with wasn't Michael O'Connor. It was you, Christopher Hayes, stripped of the protections wealth provides, living the kind of life I live every day, standing up for what's right, even when it cost you everything you'd come to accomplish. That man was real. I know he was real because I watched him risk his position to defend me against Gary. Watched him give away money he supposedly couldn't afford to help. My mother watched him choose integrity over safety again and again. Her voice softened, and when she looked at him, Christopher saw the walls beginning to lower. I don't want Michael or Christopher separately. I want the man who is both, who can move between the world of the main house and the world of the worker quarters and remain himself in both places. The man who knows how to work a wheat field and how to secure a governor's pardon. The man who sees people as people regardless of how much money they have or what their fathers were convicted of. Christopher's throat tightened with emotion too large for words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Hayes family signet ring, the one he'd used to prove his identity, the one that represented everything his name and wealth signified. This is Christopher Hayes, rich, powerful, descended from men who built empires and maintained distance from the people who worked their land. He set the ring on the grass between them, then took Rebecca's hands in his, holding them gently. But this is me, just a man who loves you completely, who will spend every day proving that the person you met by this creek was real, who understands that wealth is nothing compared to finding someone who sees your soul before your bank account. If you'll give me the chance. Rebecca looked at their joined hands, then at the ring glinting in the grass, then at Christopher's face, where every emotion he'd been hiding for 3 weeks showed plain and vulnerable. I'm scared of trusting you, of believing this is real, of letting myself hope that happiness is possible for people like me. I'm scared, too, of losing you, of discovering I'm not worthy of your love, of proving that my father and uncle were right, that distance is safer than connection. She picked up the ring, studied it for a long moment, then handed it back to him. I don't need Christopher Hayes, the wealthy rancher. I don't need grand gestures or expensive gifts or your name on legal documents. I just need you to keep being the man who sat here every Sunday and listened like my words mattered. The man who stood in the rain and chose defending me over protecting his investigation. The man who sees me as Rebecca, not as the daughter of a convicted thief or a charity case to be solved. Christopher slipped the ring back into his pocket and pulled Rebecca into his arms, feeling her finally relax against him, feeling the rightness of this moment in ways that transcended logic or reason. You have all of me, always. Their kiss tasted like creek water, and second chances like tears and hope intermingled. And for the first time since revealing his identity, Christopher allowed himself to believe that some broken things could be mended, that some trust could be rebuilt, that love might triumph over fear if both people were willing to be vulnerable enough to try. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon when the Montana sky burned gold and the wheat harvest had been completed by workers earning fair wages under fair conditions, Christopher stood in a small chapel and watched Rebecca walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She wore a simple dress of white cotton wildflowers woven through hair that caught the light streaming through windows, and the smile on her face made Christopher's eyes burn with unshed tears. Jonathan placed Rebecca's hand in Christopher's with a blessing that acknowledged both the unusual circumstances of their meeting and the genuine love that had somehow grown from deception into truth. The ceremony was brief, attended by every worker on the ranch, with Edward serving as best man and Kathleen weeping in the front row. When the minister pronounced them married, when Christopher kissed his wife for the first time as husband and wife, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers that spoke to more than just one couple's happiness. They were celebrating justice, restored corruption, defeated the victory of people who refused to accept that their station in life predetermined their worth. The reception lasted until stars appeared, music and laughter echoing across the valley. Jonathan stood to offer a toast, his voice still rough from years of prison, but his words clear and strong. 3 years ago, I lost everything. My freedom, my reputation, my hope. I sat in a cell and thought this is how my story ends, in darkness forgotten by everyone except my family. But my daughter never stopped believing in my innocence. And Christopher Hayes, a man who could have remained comfortable in his mansion and ignored the suffering happening on his land, chose justice over convenience. He gave me back my life, gave my family a future, proved that one person's courage can change the world. So I toast to Christopher and Rebecca. May their love remind us all that the greatest wealth isn't gold or property, but finding someone who sees your soul and loves what they find there. Christopher responded, his voice thick with emotion. This ranch isn't mine. It's ours. Every person who works this land, who tends these fields, who contributes their labor and skill and dedication to making this place productive, you all own this success as much as I do. We build it together, we share its rewards together, and we prove that fairness and profit can coexist if people care more about each other than about maintaining systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often do we judge people by what they own rather than who they are? How many chances at real love do we miss because we're afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to trust, afraid to believe that genuine connection is possible in a world that teaches us to see each other as competitors rather than companions. A year later, on a spring morning when life seemed determined to burst from every branch and blade, Rebecca gave birth to a son in the main house, with doctors present and Kathleen attending. They named him Jonathan Edward Hayes, honoring both the grandfather who'd survived injustice and the old foreman who'd protected Rebecca when no one else would. Christopher held his son and saw the future extending forward in ways he'd never imagined when he first descended to the worker quarters disguised as an Irish immigrant. This child would grow up knowing both worlds would understand that wealth carried responsibility. Rather than privilege, would be taught that a person's worth had nothing to do with their bank balance and everything to do with their character. On the Sunday following Jonathan Edwards' birth, Christopher and Rebecca walked to the creek carrying their son between them. They sat in the place where everything had changed, where water and honesty and unexpected kindness had transformed two damaged people into something whole. Rebecca adjusted the blanket around Jonathan Edward, her face showing the complicated joy of new motherhood mixed with exhaustion. Do you ever regret it? Giving up the comfortable life, the distance your family maintained, the protection wealth provides, against having to see how the other half lives. Christopher looked at his wife, at their son, at the land spreading out around them in waves of green and gold. I'm sitting by a creek with the woman I love and our child. I sleep better than I ever did on silk sheets because my conscience is clear. These hands that learned to work a wheat field remind me every day what really matters. What's that? That the greatest wealth is finding someone who loves you in work clothes as much as Sunday best, someone who sees your soul before your bank account, someone who knows your worst deception and chooses to love the real person underneath. You gave me that, Rebecca. You gave me everything that matters. Baby Jonathan gurgled, reaching for the sunlight dancing on water, and Rebecca laughed. Then we're the richest people in Montana. Life strips away our masks and shows us who we really are. Christopher thought he'd lost his ability to trust. Rebecca thought she'd never escape her father's shadow. But in honest labor and simple kindness, they found what we all search for, someone who loves us not for what we have, but for who we are when we have nothing to hide. That is the only wealth that truly lasts. Have you ever met someone who saw past your surface to your true self, or had to hide who you were to find genuine connection? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else today, might remind them that courage and honesty still matter in a world that often rewards neither. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we live ourselves, the ones where we risk everything for the chance at something real. Word count 6,989 words. Characters, no spaces, 39,632. Reading time, 27 minutes.